Are you lost, Grandpa? The voice was sharp, laced with the kind of arrogant impatience that only youth and a freshly pressed uniform could produce. The old man did not flinch. He stood on the edge of the pier, his gaze fixed not on the gleaming gray mountain of steel that was the USS Vigilance, but somewhere deep inside it. His hands, gnarled and stained with the memory of 1,000 engines, were clasped loosely behind his stooped back. He wore simple khaki trousers and a faded blue work shirt, clothes that seemed to have given up long ago. He was an anachronism on the pristine, orderly naval pier, a ghost of a forgotten time. Petty Officer Thorne stepped directly into the old man's line of sight, planting his polished boots with authority. "This is a restricted area, sir. Authorized personnel only." The old man's eyes, pale blue and clouded with age, slowly shifted to meet Thorne's. They held no fear, no surprise, only a deep, quiet weariness. "I hear a ghost," the old man said, his voice a dry rasp, like rust flaking off old metal. Thorne smirked. "Right. A ghost. Look, I don't have time for games. You need to move along before I call security." A low, rhythmic thrumming vibrated up through the concrete of the pier. It was a subtle, discordant note in the symphony of the warship's machinery. It was a sound that had been vexing the engineering department for 3 straight days. It was the reason the Vigilance, the Navy's newest and most advanced guided missile destroyer, was still tied to the dock instead of heading out for sea trials. "It's in the port turbine," the old man continued, as if Thorne hadn't spoken. "A harmonic imbalance. Just past the primary reduction gear." Thorne crossed his arms, the picture of condescending authority. "We have a dozen of the best engineers in the fleet working on it with sensor arrays you couldn't even imagine. I think we have it covered. Your sensors are looking for a break," the old man said, his gaze returning to the ship. "This isn't a break. It's a memory. The metal remembers a stress it once had, and now it sings about it." "It sings about it," Thorne repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What's your name, old-timer?" "Miller. Silas Miller." Thorne snorted. "Well, Mr. Miller, your expertise in naval engineering poetry is noted. Now, unless you have a pass, you're trespassing on federal property." Silas Miller did not move. He just listened. He had spent a lifetime listening to machines, and they spoke a language he understood better than words. This ship was in pain. A small, persistent pain that, if ignored, would grow into a catastrophe. "It's a G7 valve," Silas said quietly. "On the lubrication feed. It's vibrating at a resonant frequency with the shaft. It's starving the forward bearing by a microliter per rotation. Not enough to trigger an alarm. Just enough to make it scream." Thorne's patience finally snapped. "That's it. I'm done." He reached for the radio on his belt. "Let me see it," Silas said. The request was so simple, so devoid of challenge, that it momentarily stopped Thorne. "Let you what? See the multi-billion-dollar turbine on a state-of-the-art warship? Are you insane?" "I don't need to see the turbine," Silas said, a flicker of something ancient and powerful in his eyes. "I just need to listen." From a simple canvas satchel at his feet, an item Thorne had dismissed as a fisherman's lunch bag, Silas retrieved a small, worn leather roll. He untied the laces with slow, deliberate fingers. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay a single tool. It was a wrench, but it was unlike any wrench Thorne had ever seen. It was forged of a dark, strangely iridescent metal, its shape subtly wrong, custom curved and balanced. It looked ancient, handmade, a relic from some forgotten industrial age. "What's in there, Grandpa?" "A magic wand," Thorne sneered. "You probably 3D printed it in your garage." Silas ignored him, his thumb tracing the smooth, worn metal of the wrench's handle. He held it up, not to his ear, but to his temple, closing his eyes. Thorne had seen enough. This was not just a confused old man. This was a potential security threat. He reached out and snatched the wrench from Silas's hand. "All right, that's enough of this fantasy." The moment Thorne's fingers touched the metal, Silas Miller was gone. He was no longer on a sunny pier in San Diego. He was in the belly of a wounded beast, the USS Harrison, somewhere in the freezing black waters of the North Atlantic in 1944. The air was thick with the smell of cordite, burning oil, and fear. The deck plates buckled beneath his feet, groaning with the stress of a torpedo hit. Red lights flashed, casting demonic shadows. The shriek of tortured metal was deafening. A young Silas Miller, covered in grease and sweat, was wedged deep in the engine's guts. A coolant line had been sheared. Without it, the engines would seize, and they would be a sitting duck for the U-boat that was hunting them. The replacement valve was mangled. The tools were gone, scattered or destroyed by the blast. He had one thing. A crude wrench he had forged himself from the melted-down propeller of his first ship, a destroyer lost at Pearl Harbor. He called it his good luck charm. With that single, oddly shaped tool, he had bypassed the broken valve, rerouted the flow, and coaxed the dying engine back to life, all while the ship was taking on water and the depth charges from their own escorts were rattling his teeth. They had made it home. He had saved 182 souls. No one ever knew. It was just another day in the long, brutal war. The wrench in Thorne's hand felt impossibly heavy. He scoffed, flicking it with his finger. Just a piece of junk. The sound, the casual act of contempt, brought Silas crashing back to the present. He looked at the young man holding a piece of his soul and said nothing. His face was a mask of placid disappointment. Further down the pier, Chief Warrant Officer Reyes watched the exchange through a pair of binoculars from the ship's bridge wing. He didn't like Thorne. The kid was arrogant, all book smarts and no feel. But that wasn't what bothered him. It was the old man. Reyes had been in the Navy for 28 years. He had seen admirals and raw recruits, heroes and cowards. He knew how men carried themselves under pressure. This old man carried himself with a stillness that was almost absolute. It wasn't the stillness of age or infirmity. It was the stillness of a mountain, the calm at the center of a hurricane. It was a kind of authority that didn't require a uniform or a rank. And he had seen that wrench before, or rather, a drawing of it. In a dusty, classified technical manual from decades ago, a footnote in a chapter about emergency field repairs under extreme duress. The manual called it the Prometheus key, a tool fabled to have been used in an impossible repair during the Second World War. It was dismissed as a sea story, a myth. Reyes lowered his binoculars. Thorne was getting more aggressive, now physically blocking the old man, jabbing a finger in his chest. Something was deeply wrong. Reyes turned and walked briskly into the pilot house. He picked up a secure line. He didn't call base security. He called the office of the base commander. "This is Chief Warrant Officer Reyes on the Vigilance. I need to speak to the Admiral." The aide on the other end was predictably dismissive. "The Admiral is in a priority briefing, Chief. Can it wait?" "No, it cannot," Reyes said, his voice level but cold. "There is a civilian on the pier, an old man named Silas Miller. He's causing a minor disturbance with one of my petty officers. And this requires the Admiral's attention?" the aide asked, audibly annoyed. "He's holding a tool," Reyes continued, his eyes locked on the scene below. "A dark metal wrench. Custom forged. Curved. Silence." For a full 10 seconds, the only sound on the line was static. Reyes could feel the atmosphere in a room miles away shift from annoyance to ice-cold panic. The aide's voice came back, tight and strained. "Describe him again." "Elderly. Stooped. Pale blue eyes. Says his name is Silas Miller." Another pause. Reyes heard muffled, urgent voices in the background. Then the aide's voice, now stripped of all arrogance. "Chief, your orders are as follows. You are to ensure that man does not, under any circumstances, leave that pier. Do not let him out of your sight. Do not engage. Do not allow your personnel to engage further. Is that understood?" "Understood," Reyes said slowly. "Admiral Vance is on his way. God help your sailor if he's harmed that man." The line went dead. Down on the pier, Thorne had finally had enough. He grabbed Silas by the arm. "Let's go, old man. You and I are taking a walk to the security office." It was then that they all heard it. A sound that did not belong on a quiet naval pier. The high-pitched squeal of tires burning on asphalt. A convoy of 2 black sedans, flags flying from their fenders, came roaring down the access road at a speed that was utterly insane. They fishtailed to a stop just feet from the gangway, sending a cloud of dust and startled seagulls into the air. The back door of the lead car flew open before it had fully stopped. Out stepped a man who radiated pure, undiluted authority. Admiral Jonathan Vance, commander of the Pacific Fleet. 4 stars glittered on his collar. His face was a mask of cold fury. He didn't look at the ship. He didn't acknowledge the salutes of the stunned officers on deck. His eyes, like chips of granite, scanned the scene and found their target. He strode forward, his entourage of aides and security struggling to keep up. Every sailor on that pier froze, watching the four-star Hurricane make landfall. Thorne, still holding Silas's arm, felt a cold dread wash over him. He let go as if the old man's shirt was on fire. Admiral Vance did not slow down. He walked directly toward the confrontation, his gaze locked on Silas Miller. He walked past Thorne as if the young sailor were a ghost, a meaningless smudge in the air. He stopped 1 foot in front of Silas. For a moment, the two men just looked at each other. The stooped, frail old man in a worn work shirt, and the powerful, immaculate Admiral at the apex of his career. Then, in an act that sent a shockwave through the assembled crew, Admiral Vance snapped to attention. He raised his hand in a salute so sharp, so perfect, it could have cut glass. It was a gesture of profound, almost reverent respect. "Mr. Miller," the Admiral's voice boomed across the silent pier. "It is an honor, sir." Silas gave a slow, tired nod of his head. "Jonathan, you've gotten old." A flicker of a smile touched the Admiral's lips before his face hardened again. He lowered his salute and turned to face the stunned crowd, his eyes sweeping over them before landing, with the force of a physical blow, on Petty Officer Thorne. Thorne felt like he was shrinking. The air suddenly seemed too thin to breathe. "Do you know who this is?" Vance asked, his voice dangerously quiet. He didn't wait for an answer. "You stand on the deck of a multi-billion-dollar warship," the Admiral began, his voice rising with each word. "You stand here with your digital manuals, your plasma displays, and your network diagnostics. You think you command the machine." He pointed a rigid finger at Silas. This man is the machine. When your grandfathers were fighting in tin cans with slide rules and steam gauges, this man was the ghost in the engine room. He didn't need diagnostics. He could tell you the shear stress on a propeller shaft by the taste of the air. The Admiral took a step toward Thorne, who involuntarily took a step back. "This is Silas Miller." They called him the Shepherd because he brought ships home that had no business floating. He wrote half the emergency protocols you take for granted. The manual on harmonic resonance that you were supposed to memorize in A school? He wrote the original manuscript. On a napkin, in the middle of a typhoon. Vance's gaze fell on the wrench, which Thorne was still holding limply in his hand. The Admiral's eyes narrowed. He gently took it from Thorne's grasp and handed it back to Silas with the care one might afford a holy relic. "This wrench," Vance said, his voice now thick with emotion, "is forged from the propeller of the USS Arizona. Silas's older brother served on that ship. He pulled this piece from the wreckage himself. With this tool, he single-handedly saved the USS Harrison from a U-boat pack. He refused the Medal of Honor because he said he was just doing his job." The Admiral turned his full, lethal attention back to Thorne. The fury was gone, replaced by something far colder. A quiet, surgical disgust. "You," Vance said, his voice a bare whisper that carried with terrifying clarity. "You looked at a living legend. And you saw a nuisance. You looked at a man who forgot more about naval engineering than you will ever learn. And you called him Grandpa. You did not just disrespect a man. You disgraced that uniform. You have demonstrated an ignorance of your own history so profound that it borders on treason. You mistook a monument for a relic." Thorne stood, pale and trembling, the world crumbling around him. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "Admiral," a quiet voice said. It was Silas. He had stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Vance's arm. The boy was just following procedure. Vance looked down at the hand, then at Silas's face. The fury in his eyes softened, replaced by a deep, abiding affection. "He put his hands on you, see? And the ship is still in pain," Silas replied simply, turning his attention back to the silent, thrumming vessel. He looked at Thorne, his eyes holding not anger, but a teacher's patience. "The G7 valve, son. On the port side lubrication feed. It needs a quarter turn. Counterclockwise." He held out the ancient wrench. "Use this. She'll listen to it." Thorne stared at the wrench as if it were a venomous snake. He looked at the Admiral, who gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. Shaking, Thorne took the wrench. Guided by Chief Reyes, he disappeared into the ship. The crowd on the pier waited in absolute silence, the only sound the rhythmic, off-key hum of the turbine. 10 minutes passed. Then, slowly, miraculously, the discordant vibration faded. The ghost in the machine fell silent. The engine settled into a smooth, powerful purr, the sound of a healthy warship. A cheer went up from the crew on deck. Admiral Vance turned back to Silas. "What do you need, C? Anything. A new house. A boat. Name it." Silas shook his head, a small smile on his face. "Just a cup of coffee, Jonathan. And maybe a donut. It's been a long morning." Petty Officer Thorne was not discharged. Silas would not allow it. Instead, he was reassigned. He, along with every engineer in his division, was enrolled in a new, mandatory course. It was a brutal, 3-month program on naval history, engineering theory, and the unwritten lore of the service. They learned about the heroes who wore no medals, the victories won with ingenuity and grit instead of computers. The course was officially designated Naval Heritage and Engineering Protocol 774. Everyone just called it the Miller Protocol. 6 months later, Thorne, now a third-class petty officer with humility hammered into his soul, was sitting in a small, greasy spoon diner miles from the base. He was studying a tattered copy of an old engineering text, the one Silas Miller had written on a napkin. The bell above the door jingled. Silas Miller walked in, moving slowly toward a booth in the corner. He looked just the same. Faded shirt, old trousers, the quiet stillness of a mountain. Thorne's heart hammered in his chest. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly on the linoleum floor. He walked over to the old man's booth. Silas looked up, his pale eyes showing a flicker of recognition. "Mr. Miller," Thorne said, his voice cracking slightly. "Sir, I wanted to apologize. What I did, there's no excuse. I was arrogant, and I was wrong." Silas looked at the young man for a long moment. He saw the shame, but he also saw something new. Respect. Understanding. He gestured to the seat opposite him. "Sit down, son. The coffee here is terrible, but the company's good." "Thorne Saturday. You weren't wrong," Silas said quietly, stirring his coffee. "You were just ignorant. Ignorance can be fixed. Arrogance is a choice." He smiled, a genuine, warm smile that seemed to erase the years from his face. "Tell me what you've learned about harmonic ghosts." And as the old legend and the humbled sailor talked, the quiet hum of the diner's refrigerator sounded, to Thorne, like the smoothest running engine in the entire United States Navy. The lesson had been learned.